I'm Angela Beaubier. This is A Senior's Life in the Talbot Settlement. This is March 4th, thank you, March 4th, 2022. We are at Backus-Page House Museum. I will be kind of conducting the interview, but with me is Caitlin Reitsma and Shannon Carroll, staff here at the museum. And today's interview is with Blair Ferguson, so welcome.
Thank you.
So I guess introduce yourself, where you grew up, all the biographical stuff we might want to know.
Okay. I'm 57, I think 58, 57. And I was born in Port Stanley and grew up in Port Stanley until I was 20, 22, something like that. Had a great, very interesting childhood in that my mom's father and mother lived in the house right beside us, and he was a World War I vet, and so I got to meet all of his buddies when I was a young kid. I used to sit around and they would all, be drinking and smoking butts, and I was sitting in the corner, and as long as I didn't say anything, I could stay. And so that really sparked my interest in history. Yeah, so I've lived here in Wallace-town for 24 years, and yeah, just love history and try to find out everything I can about it.
And what was his name?
My grandfather?
Your grandfather.
Henry George William Ashley.
Okay.
So, and he was in the Royal Flying Corps. And so I actually have letters from Billy Bishop to my grandfather. They communicated back and forth, and Billy Bishop called him Dear Hen. So they must have been pals, I guess. So that's kind of neat, So yeah, I just come from a very historic family. First Ferguson here from Scotland was 1830, and his great-grandfather had fought at Culloden and spent 12, 15 years in jail for treason, basically.
Mm-hmm. And what were their names?
So the guy that was fought at Culloden was Alexander Ferguson, and the one that came here was Peter Ferguson. And he settled, his farm is now covered by Talbot Street Extension. So if you stand where Jumbo the Elephant is and look down, that's basically the farm out as far as Wellington Road. So he had many children, and most of them went south to the States, and all of them ended up fighting in the Civil War. But the one that stayed here, his name was Len Ferguson, and he owned a carriage making shop in St. Thomas, and there's a big statue of him in West Ave Cemetery, big white marble statue, because he was the founder of the Odd Fellows in Canada, and so all the Odd Fellows are buried underneath of him. So, and then his son, George Ferguson, made it big. Like, he was rich. He had a big house on Roseberry. He was one of the people who started the Southern Loan Bank, which TD bought out. But anyways, so he was very wealthy. When my dad was born, his parents lived with them. And my dad had like a nanny, and my great-grandfather had a batman, he called him, the guy that would shave him and get him dressed every morning. And
kind of like a valet.
Yeah.
In Britain, but
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I guess batman is a military term,
right.
Not a Cape Crusader. And anyways, so he did very well until the stock market crashed. And
1929.
And he lost everything. He lost all of the family money. He lost all of his friends' money. And when my dad was 4, he went up to his grandfather's bedroom to get him for lunch, and he was hanging from the ceiling.
Oh, your dad found him.
Yeah, when he was 4 years old. So, so my dad ended up living on Roseberry Place, which is pretty posh, to living on Omimi Street in St. Thomas, which is, he said when a train went by, him and his brother had to hang on to the bed because it would get shaken out of bed. They persevered, and my dad became, actually he was going to high school in St. Thomas, and he met my mom. My dad went to Arthur Bowden, my mom went to CCI. She had already lived in Port Stanley at that time. And World War II came along, and my dad enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force at 17. He went overseas and didn't come home for 6 years. He came home, and him and my mom got married 3 days later. And I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and they were married for 55 years before they passed away. So my dad passed away, and my mom got sick 3 weeks later and died within 4 months.
Of a broken heart.
Probably. Yeah. Just couldn't live right without him. So yeah, and so I didn't want to stay in Port Stanley. Port Stanley has changed drastically from when I was a kid, and I didn't want to bring a kid up in that environment anymore, and so we came out here, and my wife's family is from here. My mother-in-law's mom was John Pierce's daughter, so there's a connection to the area.
Yeah.
And so we ended up out here and love it.
Awesome. So which of John Pierce's daughters? Is it Catherine?
No.
No. I got the wrong one.
Neva? No. So Elaine Brown's father,
John S. Pierce,
was the brother of my mother-in-law's mom.
Okay.
And she ended up marrying Cecil Waite, and he had a farm in Iona Station, set back just before you go over the railroad tracks heading north. But they ended up buying a farm in Fingal. But anyways, she met Cecil Waite because he was the hired man on the Pierce farm, and that didn't go over very well with the Pierces. So
no, it usually doesn't.
No.
But it happens a lot.
Yeah.
In all the families. So we have noticed that in looking up some of the families here on Lakeview Line. That's who you were around.
Well, and there was limited choice, right? I mean, you didn't want to marry your brother or your cousin, and so most people were related in some way, or their children were vastly older or way too young, and so a hired man, same age, it's going to happen.
It is. Yeah, it does happen. So with your love of history, you've written some books.
I wrote a book on No. 4 Bombing and Gunnery School, and that came about. I was a member of the Southwold Veterans Association, and so we put on a Remembrance Day ceremony every year, and partly I met Lawrence Spicer, and he was a huge influence on me and had all kinds of faith in me that other people didn't. One Remembrance Day ceremony, a woman came up, and her mother was actually the postmistress of Dutton, and she came up and she had a box of Fingal Observers, which was the newspaper that the base put out every month, and she had every one, right from beginning to the end, and that's because her husband was the postmaster he was in the Canadian Postal Corps, and so he was at Fingal, and so he saved them all. And she just said, I was told that you're the historian here, you would like these. So I'm like, okay. And, I had thought, what can I do with these? Like, they're hard to display because they're brittle. And, more people that look through them, eventually there'd be nothing left. And so you can't really display them well either. So I thought, well, I'll write a book and take stories from and photos from the newspapers that I find interesting, and put them in a book. And then, so that's all I was going to do. And then this guy came up and at another Remembrance Day ceremony, and I told him what I was planning to do, and he had trained at Fingal. And he was from Windsor Way. And he said, oh, well, there's a Fingal Association, and there's a whole bunch of us still alive. And I said, oh, wow. And he said, you should talk to them. So he sent me a list with everybody's name and address and phone number on it. And I started calling them and, asked them if they wanted to be interviewed. And so the ones that did, I went and met with them and sat with them for hours and hours. And most of them were very talkative and enjoyed talking about their time at Fingal. So I took those stories and made them and added them to the stories from the newspaper and made a book, called the Fingal Observer.
When did you publish that?
2004.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I've done other smaller books that were just like not really published, but printed for, like I did a book on the history of the Roman Catholic churches in Elgin County, and that was printed just basically for the parishioners of the 5 churches in Elgin County. And I've done some newspaper art, not really newspaper articles, magazine articles, I guess, for different military magazines like Frontline and the Legion and things like that. So,
yep.
Yeah.
And then you've put together some Ellis Sifton.
So I've been saying that I'm going to write a book about Ellis Sifton for a long time, and that goes all the way back to when I was, again, in my grandfather's basement. I was like 8 years old, and this guy was talking about this incredible act of bravery that he witnessed. I went and asked my dad about it, and then my dad went, oh, well, that was Ellis Sifton. And he told me the story, and basically I've spent my entire life researching this man and putting together his story. And by doing that, I've met people who were also connected to him, who, again, told me different stories. And, and then I would meet other people, and they would tell me other stories. And each person had like a different aspect of his life. Like, some of them were military, some of them were farm related. So I think I have a pretty good rounded view of who he was. Yeah. And I think I pretty much understand why he did what he did. So I am going to write that out.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We will sell it in our gift shop.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Ellis Sifton is from Wallacestown, right? And fought in World War I. So, and he's died at Vimy Ridge.
Yeah, and the only Victoria Cross in Elgin County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he deserves, every time we talk about him, yeah.
Yeah.
All the memorials that we've got.
He deserves every ounce of recognition that he gets, because he did turn the tide. I seriously think that if he didn't do his act that ended up losing his life by, I don't think we would have won the battle that day. I think the battle would have lasted longer than it did.
Really?
Yeah.
Can you? I know it's a longer story.
So,
but just synopsis of what he did.
So just what he did. So the Canadians, everybody had tried to take Vimy Ridge. Britain had tried it many times in France, and nobody could do it. And so Arthur Currie asked to do it, and they said sure, and he said, well, I got to do it my way. I'm not doing it your way, I'm going to do it my way. And so what Arthur Currie came up with was a creeping barrage. And so he taught all the Canadians to walk at a particular pace. And if you walked too fast, you would have gotten blown up by the shells. And if you got left behind, then the line wouldn't be solid and you'd be a sitting duck for German machine gunners. So everything was going great. They started shelling at like 5:30 in the morning, and these guys were doing the Vimy walk, is what they called it. And the whole Canadian line was going up all in unison. But for whatever reason, there was just one section of the hill that they got held up. And I don't know if it was because the wire didn't get blown, because that was the purpose of the creeping barrage, was to blow up the barbed wire. So I'm not sure if a section didn't get blown up, so they got held up behind. And in military or in any football game, you don't want to get flanked. And so what was happening is that the line was continuing up, but this section was back here, and so it was leaving this big gap that the Germans could have came into. Ellis Sifton, he was in charge of a platoon, and they were trapped in a slit trench, and there was a German machine gun nest right up above them, and every time one of his men stuck their head up, because they knew they had to get ahead, they had to maintain that line. So every time somebody stuck their head up to see if they could go, this German machine gunner would get them. And so eventually Ellis Sifton just kind of had enough, and he jumped out of the slit trench and just started running up the hill with his bolt-action rifle. They say that he got shot a couple of times on the way up, obviously not fatally, but in the arm and stuff like that. And he was just like in a mad fury, running up this hill, and he dove head first into the machine gun nest and kind of somersaulted over and came up and shot all of the crew from the machine gun operation. So I think it was 5 guys that he killed, and then he stuck his head out of the slit and kind of waved all the Canadians up. So they started going forward, and they say that you could hear the cheering when they saw Ellis waving them up, because nobody else was going to do that, and so the line became solid again. And as his men were approaching the machine gun nest, Ellis heard people coming down a supply trench, and Ellis was out of ammunition, so he held his Lee Enfield Mark III like a baseball bat, and each guy that popped out of this supply trench got belted, and eventually the Germans stopped coming down the supply trench because they were piling up. By that time, the Canadians, the whole corps had reached the top, and a huge celebration broke out, and people were cheering, and all these people were patting him on his back, and his commanding officer was like, that was amazing. And a dying German officer rolled over, pulled out his Luger, and fired and shot Ellis Sifton in the head, and so he died instantly. So, and for that act, he was awarded the Victoria Cross.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, pretty amazing, especially coming from a country gentleman, right? He was a farmer, and he wasn't a violent man, and he was a good shot. He won many times at the Wallace-Town Sportsman Association, he won best shot. It was either him or his dad every year who won the best shot. So, but I mean, he wasn't shooting at people, right? He was shooting at a target. So, and yeah, by all accounts, he was a very quiet, sort of humble sort of guy, you know? Yeah. So it makes it, that act, that much more so.
He just knew what had to be done.
Yeah, yeah. He knew what had to be done, and yeah, he had had enough, basically, and he kind of knew he knew that it was going to be the end of him. Even before the battle, he wrote his sisters 98 letters, and they're all available at the St. Thomas Museum. Yeah, in the last letter, he said, you know, if you don't hear from me, don't worry. Yeah, all is well, right?
Yeah. And, well, that's the name of the book, right?
Yeah, all is well with Ellis tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he, prior to Vimy Ridge, he started giving things away, right? He ran into his cousin Len Sifton, who started Sifton Funeral Home after the war. And gave him his gloves that he had made. He had written to Stuart Pierce and asked Stuart to go to a guy in Dutton and have boots made that laced up and a set of gauntlets, like leather gauntlets that came up to here. And when he saw Len and he was talking to him, and he pulled off his gauntlets and gave them to his cousin and said, "Here, you can have these." And Len was like, "Well, don't you need them? And don't you want them? They were custom made for you." And, you know, and Ellis said, "No, I don't need them anymore." And then Len left. Len was in the mounted infantry. So they got called off. They were in different sections. So Len had to go, and he had the gauntlets with him. And Ellis was heading over to where he was supposed to be, and he ran into his next door neighbor from Wallace-Town, Sidney Keeler, and his parents owned a cheese factory. And so he ran into Sidney Keeler, and, you know, again, they're chatting, and, you know, imagine running into each other 2,000 miles away, and Ellis was surprised that Sidney was there because he was the youngest and he was a medical student, and all of his brothers were doctors and they were all in the medical corps, but Sidney didn't want to be in the medical corps, so he didn't tell them that he was in medical school. He just put down that he was a cheesemaker, and so he ended up in the infantry. And when they were done talking and they said, you know, I have to get going, Ellis pulled off his jerkin. A jerkin is a thick leather vest that kind of came down past your groin, and it kept you warm, right? And they were sought after items because they weren't part of regular Canadian kit. So the only people who got them, you had to get them from British stores, type of thing, like British Supply Depot. So he pulled it off and he gave it to Sidney, and again, Sidney's same thing. Why? And Ellis Sifton said, "I don't need it anymore." And so I know that because both Len Sifton and Sidney Keeler both wrote letters to Joe Sifton, Ellis's father, and said, you know, I saw Ellis on the day before, and yeah. So I think he had a pretty good idea that this was the end. Yeah. So
that's amazing how somebody would have that feeling, and it's such a momentous battle.
Yeah.
And that he just knew.
Yeah. Well, so prior to Vimy Ridge, like prior to the Battle of Vimy, he was sent in charge of a trench raid. And so trench raids were gruesome because nobody carried a gun, because if a gun went off, then everybody in the trench would know that you were there. So they carried, knives made out of broken bayonets, clubs with nails in them, and brass knuckles, and yeah. So it was like a hand-to-hand kind of gruesome thing, and anybody who's been in the war or in action will tell you that it's very, very different to point a gun in a direction and pull a trigger and stare somebody in the eyes and take their life. And so anyways, it was a very successful trench raid. They captured 2 Germans and brought them back, and everybody said that from that point on, Ellis had changed. He no longer was that country gentleman. And he wrote home and he said, how am I going to come home, right? How am I going to live in Wallacestown? How can I go hang out at the Ontario House and talk to somebody, and no one's going to understand me and who I was. So today we know that's post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
At that time it was just the way things were.
Yeah. Shell shock or
Yeah.
battle fatigue, all
Right.
kinds of names for it.
Yeah. And even for that trench raid, the commanding officer was going to recommend him for a Medal of Valor, but lower than the Victoria Cross, obviously, like a military medal or a military cross or a Distinguished Conduct Medal or something like that. But it never happened because the next day or the next couple of days, the Victoria Cross incident happened. So yeah, it was a gruesome war, and like people I've talked to from World War II, they had horrible stories, but most of them had funny stories as well. And I didn't get to talk to a lot of World War I vets, but I did manage to talk to half a dozen, and none of them had anything funny to say. So it was gruesome.
And I think it's World War I was the first
global conflict,
and they just had no concept of where they were going, what they were doing, and how awful it was. People who went to World War II kind of had a comparison.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if maybe they, on purpose, created different, so they had some funny stories and things to do because they had that comparison, and people would come back, they'd heard some of the stories.
Sure.
From people. Yeah.
And it's
you getting to sit and hear
Yeah.
your grandfather and his friends talking.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. Yeah. And, and to think that these guys who heard all of the stories from World War I, they went and enlisted anyways, right?
Yeah.
Like my dad, he was like a fighter pilot, right? And, and so he had talked to his future father-in-law, and his dad, my other grandfather, he was a gunner, like in the artillery. And so he was there and saw it all as well. So, they all knew what they were facing, and they went anyways. So that's
that might be
something.
the bravest thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you go sign those papers
That's right.
and
Yeah.
go anyway.
Yeah.
That'd be a good book title too.
Yeah.
We went anyway.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
World War II veterans. Yeah, we went anyway. What were some of the stories that you heard when you were a kid, listening to your grandfather and who were some of the buddies that?
So unfortunately,
I mean, you were 4, so.
Yeah. Well, he didn't die until I was, 20, not quite 20, I guess, 19, I guess I was. But when I was a kid, I never thought, obviously, who are you? I was just Grandpa's buddy, right? And so the guy who told the story of Ellis Sifton's charge up the hill, I think I can figure out who he was, because my grandfather was the head of weights and measures, in London. I worked in the Dominion building, and they have a list of the veterans who went afterwards and worked for Weights and Measures. And so I think I can probably narrow it down. If I can get that list, I can narrow it down to somebody in the 18th Battalion, and then in Ellis's company, I mean, there can't be more than one, right? I wouldn't think anyways, right? That'd be quite a coincidence if there was a half a dozen, but I think I can find out anyways. And so that's kind of my, what I'm trying to do. But I'm trying, yeah, it's not easy. They're no longer in the Dominion building in London, and all those records, and you know, they don't, things, they used to have them on the wall, and now they're in a closet someplace, right? So
Yeah.
finding that, and then I can look at it. But I have a guy who works at Weights and Measures. I met him, and he's looking for me to see if he can find it. So
That's
be
good. Because that would be really interesting to be like, I'm 99% sure.
Yeah.
This was my grandfather's friend.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I mean, like I said, he knew Billy. Did I say he knew
Yes,
Billy Bishop?
yeah.
Yeah.
You've let
So yeah, I mean, I know he knew Billy Bishop because of the letters, right? Not that I ever met Billy Bishop or anything, but unfortunately, but anyways, yeah. So I think I can find out. But yeah, I wish if I could go back, you know, to being that 8-year-old kid, I would have asked, who are you? And who are you?
Yeah.
And who are you? Right? And
Could you fill out this biographical
Yeah.
profile? And,
that's right. Yeah.
And let me
yeah.
get my tape recorder.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, everybody I talked to from World War II, obviously, I know who they are, but
Yeah.
that was, obviously, I was much older. So, yeah.
I know. The regrets of the historian
Yeah.
for not asking more questions.
That's right.
I
yeah.
have that. So let's talk more about the Fingal Gunnery School then. I know we mentioned your book, but is there some of those stories that...
Yeah, so again, most of them, when I interviewed them, most of them talked about their time at the school. And although there was, I mean, lots of people died in training. There was 19 fatalities of training accidents. 2 guys were killed 2 kilometers east of Wallacestown. Their plane just went down into a field, nosedived, and
That was the Bedford farm?
I believe so.
I think it was the Bedford farm that
Yeah.
they...
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you know, a couple of them went down in the lake off of Plum Point, and so the war really came home, right? And anybody alive at that time, they would have saw these yellow and black planes flying around all over the place, pulling targets behind them and whatnot. So a lot of them focused on the funny stories, and you gotta think these guys were, most of the people were like 17, 18 years old, and first time they were away from home, and so yeah, they had some funny stories about, you know, one guy was trying to, he was in Port Stanley at the Stork Club, met a girl, and he was like, oh, you know, I'm gonna be a gunner and all this stuff, and he said, oh, you know, I'm flying over port tomorrow at whatever time, and I'll let off a burst of the machine gun so you know it's me. And so sure enough, there he is, and they're following Kettle Creek, and he's just not thinking. He's just thinking about firing his gun at the right time to impress this girl, and he fired it, and all the bullets went whipping through an upstairs apartment. And the woman was cooking dinner making lunch for her husband, and all of a sudden there's 303s whipping through the walls, and thankfully she didn't get hit, but it was shot up, right? So that guy got in trouble. But yeah, and another guy, he told me, so in his class of trainees, was a Maori from New Zealand. And because it was the British Commonwealth, and so people came from Trinidad, Tobago, Bermuda, Bahamas, New Zealand, Australia, like everything that recognized the British Crown as their leader, they came. And so there was a Maori, indigenous Maori, and he had like the half face tattoo and the whole bit. And they went down to the Stork Club, and they were drinking, right? And this Maori got up on stage and stripped down to his skivvies and started doing the native Maori dance on stage, making all these bizarre war faces and screaming and yelling. And so, I mean, in like whatever year, like 42, I think it was, the chances of somebody from Port Stanley meeting a Maori from New Zealand were like a gazillion to one, right? Yeah. Very, very few people would have traveled to New Zealand in their life. You had to go by boat, and it would have been, 3 months to get there. So, I always think, wow, what an amazing thing, right? Like, bringing these cultures together. So it was a horrible thing, in the sense that they were training to go to war, and many of them didn't come home, but it brought all of these people together, and from all over the world, and brought them into little old Fingal. And so, Port Stanley, Wallacestown, Dutton, like all of these communities around, all these guys would have been running around in blue uniforms, and it changed a lot of people's lives. Few of them came back after the war and married people that they had met in the area. I know the one House girl from the House brothers, they had sisters, and the guy came back and married her, and and then that's something I talk to about kids, is that the war necessarily didn't happen all over there. It did happen here, and people did lose their lives, like I said. And besides the 19 training fatalities, I mean, young men died from tonsillitis and pneumonia, and there's 2 Australians buried in South Park Cemetery in St. Thomas, and they died of measles, right? So because they just didn't know how to treat it then, and there was a hospital there, like it was a Fingal. It was 6 farms, and it basically became a city, right? It just a little bit smaller in St. Thomas. It trained 6,500 men over that time. So a lot of the training was done by women, because all the men were going over, and so a lot of the training was done by women, and especially bomb aiming, because women had a better aptitude towards mathematics than men, so they said. And so they used trigonometry to figure out, like, to drop bombs, right? And they used this huge camera that filled up a whole room, and it was called the camera obscura, and they would look through it, and a 3-dimensional map was being pulled underneath of the camera on like a little hand roller thing. Manually, yep, yeah, no.
Yeah, some person is rolling the map for you, yeah.
Yep, and so the men took a picture instead of dropping a bomb, and if the picture, they could tell by the picture how close they were to where they wanted to be hit. And that was all done by women. And the woman in charge of it, her name was Florence Nightingale.
No.
Yeah, and everybody called her Gail. And she was a beautiful woman. I never got to meet her. She had passed away. I met her daughter, and her daughter gave me a huge box of photos that her mom had kept. But every guy I talked to, oh, Florence Nightingale, yeah, Gail, yeah, because she looked like a movie star, you know. So yeah, and you know, again, they were kids, and Air Force jackets have a little, not to be crude, but Air Force jackets have a little pocket right inside, and it's like this wide and that tall. And to get off base, you had to show the guard that that pocket had 2 condoms in it, or you weren't allowed off base.
Interesting.
Yeah, because if you caught a
Venereal disease, yes.
you were dishonorably discharged, and your life would be over, because nobody would hire you if you were dishonorably discharged.
True.
So you had to have 2 condoms to get off base.
Wow.
They never checked them coming back, but but going out, you had to have them. So I just think that's funny, you know.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good idea,
Sure.
right? Like the whole idea of the concept of it makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's one of those World War II things that you just don't even
No.
you don't even think about that.
No, and I mean, we're in today's age, we're very open about sexuality and stuff like that. And back then, it was like no, right? You know, you just didn't talk about things like that. So, yeah, I just always thought that was funny.
But that's funny that somebody from the top thought of that to have that in their uniform and to make that a supply. Yeah. That you'd have to have on, because they'd have to be supplied all the time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, part of their kit, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you know, I mean, the one guy I interviewed, he became a prisoner of war and ended up in the 1,000-mile death march that at the end of the war, a group of SS took all of these Allied prisoners with them and started heading towards Switzerland, because they were trying to get out of the country, and they figured if they had Allied soldiers with them, they could say, "Oh, look, we're helping these guys out," right? And they were, you know, but a ton of them died on the way because they had no food, and you know, a lot of them weren't dressed properly and everything. And so yeah, he was really interesting. Al Smith was his name, you know, and he was. When he first went down, the French resistance took him in, and so he spent all this time, you know, living underground basically with, again, kids who were the French resistance, who were going out in the night and blowing up Germans and stuff like that. So I mean, it was just, talking to him was like, wow, right? You know, and yeah, just, and of course one guy was Don Herron, the Canadian actor, and so he was funny. He, excuse me, he never went overseas, but you know, he was just, I mean, he's a comedian, so everything he said was not necessarily true, but it sure sounded funny. Yeah. So
that's so cool. I know, because I've interviewed Iris Page a couple times, and she mentioned that, you know, if you were going to St. Thomas or anywhere around and you saw any of the soldiers walking, you pulled over and they got a ride. Yeah. Or they came home with you and they got a meal. And yeah, she said that was very common here, that Grace and Morley would help people. And I think Morley Page I think he was the president of the Red Cross, the Red Cross here, and then he was on the committee to honor everyone who had served in Dunwich Township. He was part of that committee. Oh. So that's the connection here with the Page family. Right. But yeah, back to some of the other committees and different ways that you've served
so
in the community.
I'm on the Dutton Dunwich Heritage Committee, where we attempt to save old buildings, and if not, I mean, get buildings recognized for not necessarily just their historic significance, but also the way they're built. Yeah. Because obviously building changes all the time, and so you can tell when a house was built by, you know, how the eaves are and all that, the corners and whatnot. So we try to get all the homes and churches and whatever recognized as being historically significant, and hopefully, you know, save them from being altered or torn down.
Yep.
So I'm on that, and now I'm on the historical committee. I
Yes,
guess
so
that's
it's
what called.
the West Elgin Genealogical and Historical Committee.
Yeah.
Now.
So I'm a new member of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and yeah, I think that's about it. I mean, I've done most of the stuff I just kind of do on my own. Like I go to high schools and do talks all the time, and I don't think there's a service club that I haven't been to and talked to, you know, like the Lions and Kiwanis and Catholic Women's League, and I have a huge collection of they all give me like letter openers or, you know, cup and saucers, and I'm a big tea drinker, but yeah, it's funny, they always give me something. So anyways, I've been talked to all those. I went and talked about number 4 Bomb and Gunnery School at what's it called? Just zoomed out of my head there. Military. It's in Toronto, right beside the head bank there. It's oh, sorry.
Don't know.
Yeah. It was, you have to, it's like, it's like a old boys club in that, you know, everybody sits in all these big leather chairs and a huge library and spears from Zulus on the wall and stuff. It's, something war, Canadian War. Anyways, I can look it up on my phone. But anyway, I spoke there, and that's just a wild place in that they have the seat out of the Red Baron. So yeah, if you Google where the seat of the Red Baron is in Toronto, yeah, you know, in this case, and Roy Brown gave it to them, right? And you can see where the holes are in the back of the seat and everything, and there's also like a section of the tail fin, you know, from the Fokker triplane, and there's just everywhere you go, there's like, wow, look at that, whoa, look at that. So it was a real honor to go and talk there, and most of the guys were veterans, and yeah, so that was probably one of the more interesting talks I gave. So
Did you find it?
It's the Royal Military Institute of Canada.
That's
Aha.
it. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Institute.
Institute.
It sounds, with the comfy chair description, it
Yeah.
sounds like an institute.
Yeah.
Yes.
And all these guys sitting around a bar smoking cigars. Yeah.
That sounds fun, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like a big gentleman's club. What do you find is the reaction when you go to the high schools to talk? What is it that you get back from them?
Yeah, so people always say, oh, it must be hard. You know, they must not pay attention and stuff. And I find them mostly are just dumbfounded, right? I don't know if it's the way I talk or what. But yeah, they're not on their phone. They're staring at me and listening to every word I say. And I think it's because I always start off with telling them that, you know, these people, they're not like, it's not like the movies where they're 35 years old, right? They're your age, you know, if not your age, your brother, right? And so that kind of drives it home to them. And I'm always amazed at the questions that they ask, and you know, and
What are some of the ones that really impressed you?
there was a girl once, and she'd asked me a bunch of questions, but she said, you know, do you ever think this is going to happen again? And, you know, I said, yeah, so World War I ended, and it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And since that day, there has never been one day of peace on this earth. For some reason, we just want to kill one another. And that really upset her,
Yeah.
right? That, I said, I hate to say this, but it will happen again. And I said, unfortunately, we make the same mistakes over and over and over again. So, I said, if you want to do something to make sure that it doesn't happen, then learn your history and make sure that others understand what happened, and so it doesn't happen again, right?
Yeah.
So
That
yeah.
would have been hard for them to hear.
Yeah,
Because I think we all live pretty cushy lives, and
absolutely.
yeah, I think anyone who loves history, I think they know it can happen. Because I've always thought, well, that could happen tomorrow. But yeah, anyone who just, they don't think history's important, they're walking around in their lives just thinking everything's,
Everything happened a long time ago, but
yeah.
everything repeats itself.
Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
not to get into current politics, but
No, but yeah, Joseph Stalin annexed the Ukraine in 1934, I think, and he did it by encircling them and starving them out. He strangled them, right? And that's exactly what Putin's doing now, right?
Because what did they think? It's over 1 million people that they think that died from being starved.
Oh yeah,
in the 30s.
Yeah. And then he just repopulated it with Russians, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it was a part of the USSR.
And hid all of that, and
Oh yeah.
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 Because that's just kind of more recent that people are admitting.
Oh yeah, because
this many million people in Ukraine
nobody
died.
knew until the Iron Curtain fell, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that was all hid.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it bothers me, especially having a 19-year-old son.
Oh yeah.
That our government continues to make the same mistake in that, there's a war, we're ill-prepared, and we send off a group of people who are untrained and ill-equipped, and they become cannon fodder, right? Of course they die, right? And then we build up this huge military that, is the envy of the world, and then the war ends, and then we get rid of it all again, right? And then World War II happened, same thing, right? Get rid of it all, Korea, and now, what is it, 60% of the personnel in the Canadian Armed Forces have never fired a gun. Because they're clerical. 60%.
Oh, I was gonna say they're
Yeah.
fired in training, right?
No, but because they're clerical.
They're clerical.
60% of the armed forces personnel,
Paper pushers.
yes, are clerical in some way or other. They could audit Putin really well, but
We'd find the trail of money.
yeah, but yeah, so
I guess, you know what? That is Canada's story in every war ever, is we are not prepared, and then look at us now, we persevered. Oh, we're not prepared again.
right,
But we rose above, and
yeah,
that's
but it's
awful.
never it's never the politicians' sons.
It's the people.
It's everybody else's sons who go.
That's
right?
true.
So if Xavier goes, then I guess but
I never thought about it. Because it's always written as Canada overcoming the not being prepared.
right.
And we make ourselves sound great. But wouldn't it be better if we were prepared?
That's right. Well, they said that if I was listening to a retired general from the Canadian Armed Forces, and he said that if we want to make a difference in this Ukrainian conflict, then we need 340,000 men to join the military now. Yeah, 340,000. to join, like now,
Pe-
today.
people?
Yes, yes. Sorry, yes, women do.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
he might have said only men. I don't know, but yeah.
I think he did, but yes,
Yeah.
no, women do.
We mean
yeah, women
everybody.
do go into combat
in their 20s.
in their 20s.
Because he probably doesn't want anybody.
Yeah, I don't know.
Older.
But anyways.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
We're always ill prepared.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and there was a time when, we were at the forefront of aviation and the Avro Aero, and that thing was years ahead of anybody else design and capability, and oh no, we don't want to do that. So we get rid of it, right? And I mean that
was the 60s, right, when they scrapped?
that was Diefenbaker, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean he said that we don't want to be so warlike, and we don't want to be involved in air races and stuff like that where you're trying to build each other out, and you don't have to do that. I mean the jobs that it would have created would have been phenomenal, right? Because and now our Air Force, not called the Air Force anymore, it's called the Air Arm of the Canadian military, but we have 35-year-old jets, that somebody else didn't want, and I always say we can dazzle them with a snowbird display.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have outdated jets, and we don't have that many of them. Like maybe 20, right? That's it, right? And they're strictly trainers, right? They train people to be pilots. So yeah, it's unfortunate, it's a bleak way to look at things, but hopefully it doesn't come to that.
Well, that's always the hope.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to tell us about yourself?
Myself.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I met a woman who drastically changed my life when I talked to her, and that's because she was a survivor of a concentration camp.
Oh.
And she was from Montreal, and she was studying in France. She wasn't Jewish, but the man that she ended up falling in love with, a Frenchman, and they got married, and she was living there, and he became part of the French resistance. And so she was part of the French resistance. And so she was captured and went to it was a concentration camp just for women, mostly political prisoners. Anyways, she was tortured by the Gestapo, and and packed into trains, and went from Ruth Haven, I think it was, or something like that. And she went from one concentration camp to another, and witnessed the horrendous things going on. She witnessed people being incinerated, and so I had to go talk to somebody after, because I'd wake up in the middle of the night, having night terrors, right? Because she really opened up, right, and kind of told me everything that she experienced, and it was, I mean, how so many of them survived, I don't know, and how many of them carried on, like set that aside, and like she came back to Canada and moved back to Montreal, and years later got married again and had a family, and and I don't know how you can just kind of turn that off, right? So so everything that I've heard isn't necessarily good, I guess, and I mean,
No.
I've heard lots of guys talk about, my dad told me about, he stopped making friends with the guys who came on base because he was tired of losing them, right? Because, yeah, your life expectancy of a fighter pilot was like 6 hours. So, you know, and thankfully he managed to complete his operations. He did whatever, 63 hours, I think. So, but yeah, you know, just imagine, you know, and he said, you know, new replacements would come in and he wouldn't even want to know their name.
That was my next question. Did he just,
Yeah.
because, you know, we've all seen, I forget which movie it is, but they just call, your name's Joe. And they
Yeah.
would just call everybody
Yeah.
this whatever this name is that they chose.
Yeah.
And because they just couldn't deal with.
Yeah, right. And so, and yeah, you know, I mean, my dad, like I said, you know, I'm the youngest of 6 kids. He had a construction business, and yeah, he just kind of set that all aside. I don't know if I could do that. I'm pretty sure I couldn't.
I think we all think, oh, I don't know how they did that. I couldn't do that. But I think when you're required, you might find out what you can
Yeah,
actually do.
sure. I know my dad
But-
never got angry. It was like never lost his cool, nothing. Like, didn't matter what happened. He was like, meh.
Yeah, but nothing that could happen here was as bad as,
No.
right? So
no.
I could see why he would.
That's right. I
Keep his
blew
cool
up
back.
a truck once. One of the construction trucks.
Yeah.
It blew it up in our laneway, and the hood came flying off, and I ran into the house. Dad, Dad, Dad! Truck's on fire! Truck's on fire! And he was watching the hockey game. Right? He was a huge Montreal Canadiens fan. He was watching the hockey game. Yep, go put it out. And that was it. You know, that was it.
Well, I mean, that's what you needed to do, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I needed to put it out. But yeah, so.
Did he participate in any, I don't want to say bigger name operations, but, you know, any I guess notable would be.
Yeah, so he was stationed in northern Scotland, and so protecting, because of the North Sea, once Germany had taken over Norway, they had a direct, very short link to the United Kingdom. And so he was based up there, so every time bombers came over the North Sea, his responsibility was to stop them.
Okay.
So that's where he was the whole time. So.
Okay. So he wasn't over land then, he was more.
Well, yeah, like, I mean, he was based in land, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was more keeping them,
yes, away, yeah. Keep
from
them-
getting over land.
That's right, yes, yeah. And so I have his battle dress jacket, you know, his little jacket that comes to here. And I always show people that the collar is completely worn away. Just the collar is gone. Like, there's a groove in it where the material's gone. And that's from him looking behind him for planes.
Okay.
Coming, like, right? Because bombers always had fighter escorts. And so from him looking around behind him, wore that collar away, you know? And yeah, I just, you know, imagine that, you know, yeah.
Looking so much that you've just worn that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, you know, I'm thankful for every story that I heard and every veteran that I ever got to speak to. But yeah, a lot of them went through some pretty horrendous things for us, right?
Yeah.
And I always tell kids that too, that they didn't do it. That's usually how I end my talks with high school kids, is that they didn't do it for themselves, right? They're, you know, but they did it for you, even though you didn't exist. They did it for you, right? And so you need to be thankful, because your life could have been vastly different, right? And I remember once somebody asked me, well, how, you know, and so I went around the room and I said, well, you wouldn't be here because you are Afro-American, so you're not going to be here. You're not alive. Your parents aren't alive, right? You know, and oh, you got blue eyes and blonde hair. Well, you're going into a camp to have babies. That's your job, you know. It doesn't matter if you want to be a doctor. Your job is to have babies, right? And So I just went around and kind of picked people out and said, you know, and what would happen to them otherwise. And that really brought it home to them. I guess they were a little bit, they weren't so enthused, I guess, as other ones. So, but after that, they were like, "Oh, geez," right? So, yeah, it's just I hate Hollywood movies because you know they're so ridiculous.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're entertainment.
Yeah, yeah.
But they're not the nitty gritty of.
No,
Why would
no.
be
They're
there?
you know some of them are better than some, but yeah, I guess they couldn't. If they showed what it was truly like, you know, yeah.
Well, we wouldn't be allowed to show them.
Yeah, people wouldn't want to see them, right? Everybody would have night terrors.
Yeah, I was gonna say we don't need therapists positioned outside the theater.
Yeah.
What would be your main message that, not just for kids when you go to the school, but anybody from one of, you know, when you talk, you know, giving the talks about either war.
Right. Well, and you know, so my main message to everybody, not necessarily about war, but everybody, is to learn your history and where you came from and who you are and what your ancestors did in order for you to be here, right? Because pioneers didn't have it easy either, and or immigrants, you know, they're Dutch immigrants in the 50s and Portuguese immigrants in the 60s, and so
and the First Nations people who were here,
right,
as everybody's showing up.
yeah,
for sure.
yeah, and so yeah, you know, that's something that you should learn when you have the opportunity before it's too late, right? You know, even if you're not interested, you might, in doing that, you might become interested, right? To find out that, you know, your great-grandfather, you know, carried his sister on his back through, you know, or whatever, right? So that would be my one message to everybody, is just learn your family history and the history that surrounds you, right? The history of your community, and because all communities have very interesting, you know, history, and there's like funny stories and there's serious stories, and so learn that. But yeah, the military, as a military aspect, is I always tell kids to, you know, because they're the future, right? They're the future politicians. They're the ones who are going to vote and have a say in what goes on. And so I always say, you know, learn military history, like or not necessarily learn it, but come to understand it, so that when it comes time for you to choose a prime minister, you know, you have enough understanding to think, is this guy going to take us to war because of his ego, or is this guy going to, you know, keep us at peace because he's a negotiator and doesn't have a big head, and right, all that sort of stuff, right? Yeah, you know, and then hopefully we won't go to war again, right? Because it's always politicians who start the wars, but unfortunately they never fight them, right? So if it was just politicians fighting one another, there would be no wars, right? But like I said, it's never the politician, and it's never the politician's kids. It's everybody else who ends up paying the sacrifice. So yeah, it's important, you know. It's just, as gruesome as it is, it's important to understand how it happened, right? Like, you know, like World War I was a family squabble that got out of control. It really was, right?
For sure.
Like, you know, Tsar Nicholas was King George V's first cousin. Yep. Right? And their other cousin was Kaiser Wilhelm, right? They were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria, you know, and yeah, and they just...
And they signed those treaties I think that's the domino effect of those treaties.
Right.
If somebody makes war on you, we've obligated ourselves to, and it was just
Right.
yeah, you've obligated yourselves.
Yeah, and so that's what scares me about today is because Russia has signed an agreement with China.
Yeah.
Right? And they've said that they will, if China will help them in taking over the Ukraine if Russia helps China in taking over Taiwan. Right? And yeah, so hopefully it doesn't go beyond that. But yeah, like World War One, like I said, it was a family squabble, you know, and I mean, World War Two, again, you know, it kind of happened because of World War One.
Yeah.
And the way that Germany was treated. You know, up until 1938, everybody thought Adolf Hitler was a great guy, right? He was, Time magazine made him Man of the Year, right? Because he took a country out of poverty and out of, you know, revived their economy and put everybody to work and blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, he used those roads to goose step into Poland, right? And so, yeah, and I mean, Hitler had written Mein Kampf years before he ever came to power. And so anybody who read that book had to know and understand that, oh, this guy's unbalanced, and if he gets into power, we're in for a load of trouble, right? Because it's all laid out very clearly, everything. The Holocaust, the whole bit.
He was a wide open book, literally.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they all just, he can't mean that.
Yeah.
Appeasement.
Yeah, that's right.
Appeasement.
Yeah. So, and I don't understand why we can't get along. So hopefully, if the youth of today are better educated all over the world, they will have a better understanding of what causes wars, and so therefore won't do it. Hopefully.
Awesome.